if you need to leave. I now would like to welcome to the podium Christina Fagerstall, who will introduce us to our today's speakers.
Thank you so much. As you heard, my name is Christina Fagerstall, and I'm a member of the UN Committee of New Canaan. And I want to thank all of you for joining us on this 48th year of Earth Day to learn more about climate risk mitigation. First of all, thanks to New Canaan Library for co-hosting today's lecture, and I would especially like to thank Lisa Oldham and Christy Chumley for their hard work and support. Just so you know, the UN Committee of New Canaan works to bring great lectures to our town, and if you would like to support our committee, you can visit our website at uncommittee.org, and we would appreciate any donation of support. And now, for today's speakers, we are very privileged to have Radley Horton of Columbia University join us, as well as Drew Mcgrattan. Drew Mcgrattan is a co-executive producer of the Years Project, makers of Years of Living Dangerously, an award-winning television documentary series about climate change. Mcgrattan produced 2 of the stories in the series' 2nd season, which was broadcast on National Geographic in over 170 countries and 45 different languages. Now he's helping the Years team bring its climate-focused content to an even larger global audience via social media. Prior to Years, Mcgrattan worked with NPR, the New York Times, the BBC, and CBS 60 Minutes, garnering 3 Emmys and an Edward R. Murrow Award. He lives with his wife and 2 daughters here in New Canaan. So I'd like to welcome Drew up to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As was mentioned, I work with the producers of a documentary series on climate change, which my colleague Radley Horton appeared in one of the episodes in the 1st season. So I thought before we hear from him, it would be nice to play a little from that series and his appearance to give you an idea of the kind of expertise he can bring. So this clip is about the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy, which many of you may remember from about 5.5 years ago, and runs about 7 minutes. And after that, we'll bring it. I'll toss it over to Radley. Stand by.
See where that storm surge basically pushed right across the beach, right through these neighborhoods, and has basically inundated these streets. We'll count them off: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Again, close to 12 blocks inland. So again, that's a pretty far distance here.
In the U.S., Superstorm Sandy left over 100 people dead. Most of them drowned in the record storm surge. Here on Staten Island, some people faced down a wall of water 16 feet high. After the storm, Pat Tresh spent a week in the hospital. Now that she's out, she has to bury her husband George and daughter Angela. The loss is felt by the whole community. Pat's home was completely washed away by the storm. For now, she's staying in temporary housing provided by her church.
I'm not used to this, being by myself.
Seems like it was yesterday. I still have nightmares. There's not a day that goes by that I don't relive that last half hour with my family. Our last dinner together. I relived that whole experience with the water coming up over us in the house. How I got pushed out of the wall when I lost her.
My husband
was always there for Angela. Now he's gone. It's very hard. She touched so many lives.
If Angela Dresch had survived, this is the high school she would have attended.
So all of you guys were here during Sandy, right?
Yes. It was very scary. My house was shaking. We stayed upstairs on the second floor the whole night.
I live in Great Kills, and the harbor was completely destroyed. There were boats in houses, and it was absolutely insane.
Actually went to
With all the talk about climate change following the storm, these students have some questions. Two climate scientists, Dr. Radley Horton and Dr. Heidi Cullen, both Columbia University PhDs, offer to help.
Just by show of hands, how many of you guys believe that global warming is actually real, that temperatures are increasing? So, unanimous agreement that temperatures are rising. How many of you think that it's our fault? Okay, so we got some questions. Gabriella, right? Where do you kind of think it's not us?
I know that we contribute because we have been burning fossil fuels, but I don't think that we're doing it enough so that we're causing climate change. Like the Earth, I feel like naturally does it. Then the Earth has to go through its cycles. I don't believe it.
Yeah. Well, Natalie, what do you tell Gabriella when she says that she doesn't believe it?
I tell her she's crazy. Well, because I don't know. I feel like since the Industrial Revolution, fossil fuels have been using at an extreme rate, like cars, heat. I think humans definitely play a major role in
Well,
the
you know,
impact.
and it's fascinating because there were scientists who kind of made this connection that carbon dioxide was this thermostat, right? You crank up carbon dioxide, you crank up temperature, you crank down carbon dioxide, you crank down the temperature. And I think for me, as a scientist, what really pushed me over the edge was when I began to understand you can actually chemically fingerprint the CO2 in the atmosphere to different sources. Multiple lines of evidence do allow us to track it back to fossil fuel burning. And 1 out of every 4 carbon dioxide molecules in the atmosphere today was put there by us.
But I don't think that we are contributing to it so much that we're causing Sandy, and I don't believe that.
Right, right.
So I'm kind of agreeing with Gabriella on that point, but I don't know. I feel like human impact maybe played a role in that, but also the high tide with the moon definitely made the severity of the storm much worse.
That's a great thing to talk about. What aspects can we attribute to human activity, and what can't we? There are all these different elements that had to come together to make this terrible storm surge, but one of them was an extra foot of sea level that we had over the last century, largely as a result of climate change. What seems like a little bit, 1 foot, can actually have a huge impact on how frequently we get extreme events. It's like, if you think of a basketball analogy, it's the equivalent of like raising the floor of a basketball court by 1 foot without changing the height of the rims at all. You're just gonna get that many more slam dunks in the form of coastal flooding. And it did make Sandy worse, right? I mean, there were some areas where that extra foot absolutely made a difference.
A detailed analysis by the research organization Climate Central shows how global warming made more homes vulnerable to a storm like Sandy. Without sea level rise, flooding from Sandy would have reached about 8 feet above high tide. When you factor in that extra foot of sea level, most of which is due to climate change, the differences seem small at first. A block here, a few houses there, but over miles of densely populated coast, it adds up. In New York City alone, climate change put the homes of some 75,000 additional people in the path of the storm surge. And it's only going to get worse. Scientists say that by the end of the century, some parts of the coast could see Sandy-level storm surges every single year.
So in case you didn't notice, the gentleman who was in that last clip there is someone who's joining us today. Radley Horton is an associate research professor at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, an adjunct research scientist at the Center for Climate Systems Research, NASA GISS. His research focuses on climate extremes, tail risks, climate impacts, and adaptation. Radley was a convening lead author for the 3rd National Climate Assessment. He currently co-chairs Columbia's Adaptation Initiative and is principal investigator for the Columbia University World Wildlife Fund Advanced Partnership and the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration's Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments funded Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast. Ladies and gentlemen, Radley Horton.
Thank you, Drew. Thanks to all of you for the chance to be here to speak with you today on Earth Day. And I would like to echo, thanking you for taking some time from the beautiful day outside to talk about some matters which are, certainly dire and concerning in a lot of ways, but I think also we'll be able to have a discussion about some sources of optimism looking towards the future. Grace, we can just go to slideshow.
Technical assistance.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So really, if there are sort of 4 messages I'd like to highlight before I get started. Climate change is real. Human activities are largely responsible for what we're experiencing today since the Industrial Revolution in terms of changing climate. Another critically important thing to highlight is that we are experiencing the impacts right now. This isn't just something out 2 generations, 3 into the future. These problems are all going to get much more severe further out into the future, but we're experiencing the effects right now. But fortunately, 4th point, there are a range of things that we can do to minimize the impacts and, if we're aggressive enough, reverse some aspects of the problem as well. So, I'll start out just by highlighting that there are many different lines of evidence that point towards a changing climate. We hear the most about global average temperatures. I'll talk about that quite a bit. But think about all these other drivers, these other forces that are changing as well. Warming of the upper oceans, reduction in sea ice, reduction in land-based ice, more moisture in the atmosphere. A whole series of aspects, each of which can be assessed independently as we work to ascertain the role of human activities, burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, for example, in driving this problem today. So I'll start with just sort of a quick overview of what I think will be familiar to a lot of folks before we can hone in on some more cutting-edge material around extreme weather events and emerging evidence about some of the roles that a changing climate can have on our economies, on geopolitics, and conflict. Those are things I wanted to make sure to briefly highlight in my time here. But first, sort of a quick overview of things. What you can see here are a bunch of independent data sets pointing out to the sort of increase in global average temperatures near the surface that we've been experiencing going back over a century or so now. And what you can see here is sort of running average across several years depicted in those colored bands. But the other thing you can do, if you can see it in the back, is the individual years showing up as dark sort of bar graphs. What you can see if you look closely is that as long as we average across the entire globe, the statistics of temperature have already shifted dramatically. We've essentially entered a regime where it's almost impossible at the global scale, if we average across an entire year, to get a cold year. The statistics have already shifted. When we look at individual places, when we look at shorter periods of time, there's still a lot of that random variability that we call weather. But for a lot of key decisions, already the statistics have shifted in a way that impacts our societies and calls for new approaches to decision making, I'll argue today. So another data point here, I haven't linked them together yet, I'm just showing 2 different sets of trends. Here what you're seeing is greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a couple different scales. So in the top right, you can see for a few of these greenhouse gases, how much their concentration has increased and the speed at which it's increased since the Industrial Revolution, say over the last couple hundred years, a little bit more. For carbon dioxide, for example, more than a 40% increase since the Industrial Revolution. And as we heard in that last clip, it's actually trivial to identify the fact that a lot of that carbon is from a fossil source. We can clearly trace it and see that it came from essentially the ancient forests of the past. But when we look to track carbon as well, we can look individually, sort of year by year, as shown in that plot at the bottom right. What you can see there is essentially the breathing, if you will, of the atmosphere on a yearly scale. We're experiencing right now the green up in the northern hemisphere, where we have a lot more vegetation, a lot more forest than we do in the southern hemisphere. As a result, every winter you see a higher greenhouse gas concentration due to that sort of exhalation, with the de-leafing of the flowers in the northern hemisphere, of the plants in the northern hemisphere. Now those plants and trees will start taking up that carbon dioxide. Again, more trees in the northern hemisphere than the south, leading to that year-to-year variation that you see. More importantly, superimposed on that really large trend, right? But just to show you that these are trivial measurements, essentially, very easy to make. But now what we'd really want to do, of course, is to link these things, right? We've just seen two graphs going up so far. What are some of the different lines of evidence that they're linked physically? So the basic physics, I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into this in detail. I hope these slides can be made available online. Anyone can reach out to me after this or after this event or in the future if you want to get into any of this in more detail. And I look forward to Q&A as well. But basically we have this effectively one-way blanket, if you will. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, very effective at blocking the wavelengths that the Earth, at its temperature, attempts to radiate heat back to space. As a result, a lot of that heat gets sent back down to the surface. And if you put more carbon in the atmosphere, more gets sent down, leading to warming. By contrast, sunlight, a much shorter wavelength, is very effective at penetrating through that blanket, if you will. So you put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and more of these other greenhouse gases, you warm the surface. And these basic physics have been well understood for close to 200 years now. Again, we can maybe in the discussion get into some of this more. So I've shown some historic trends now. I want to get us towards thinking about the future. And one of the key tools to understanding what we're going to see in the future is climate models. Our attempts to sort of build in all the key physical processes that drive not just the atmosphere, but the ocean, sea ice, all these interactions with the biosphere, with vegetation. Another thing we don't have time to talk about a lot now, but there's one slide I always want to show about climate models, and it's a slide that helps link what we just saw about global temperature trends to what I mentioned about greenhouse gas concentration. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this figure. So the first thing you're seeing here, let's just look at the graph on the right. That black line is global average temperature, smoothed across several years. So we remove some of the year-to-year variation and basically just look at the sort of 5-10-year running averages of global average temperature going back to, say, 1915 or so. That's the black line. And this graph actually ends in 2000. If we continued it further into the future, we'd see a lot of additional increase. So some periods where temperatures have dropped a little bit, but an overall upward trend. So that's really well known. What I want to highlight, and I hope people can see it, is these two bands. Maybe I'll just walk over here for a second. People make that out? Okay. So that first sort of shadow puppet I was making there was a light blue band that indicates the temperature values that you get when you run a climate model starting in the year 1910 or so with the greenhouse gas concentrations that were in the atmosphere at that time. That was a period when we had about 30% less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because we hadn't burned that many fossil fuels yet. If you start a whole series of climate models roughly 100 years ago at that greenhouse gas concentration level and run them forward 100 years at that greenhouse gas concentration level, you get that blue band that I just indicated. It's a band because each of the climate models differ a little bit. There's random natural variability. There are natural processes like volcanoes and sunspots that are built into those models. You can see how much they deviate from the observed temperature trends. But if we look at the other band, which I think is much easier to see, that's that orange band that most of the time captures the global average temperature, although you can find a few year periods where the temperature deviates from it. That's those exact same climate models, again started in 1910, 1920, but what's different that time is each year you're ramping up the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to match what actually happened year by year over the last 100 years. So climate models aren't just a tool that we use to say what we think is going to happen 100 years from now. They're a way to test different hypotheses. And what you're seeing here is essentially a test showing that if you want to predict the past and find the right drivers, you need to include the greenhouse gas concentrations, just like you need to include the natural variability as well. So if we're thinking about how to plan and make decisions for the future, about our infrastructure, about our agriculture, about whether we want to burn fossil fuels or not in the future, if we considered one model that assumed human activities weren't part of the problem, that blue band, the other sort of acknowledging the problem, essentially what I'm saying is we need to make our decisions based on the idea that stationarity is dead. The climate statistics of the past are over, essentially. These statistics have all shifted, and they're going to shift even more in the future. We need to shift our infrastructure and various aspects of how we live to sort of keep up with this dynamic environment. So now I'll shift gears a little bit and start to transition to some of the ways that we are experiencing these climate impacts here and in other places. First, a quick look at spot by spot across the entire globe, what that warming trend looks like over the last 110 years. So this is, 110-year trend. Anywhere you see purple colors, those are areas that have warmed about 4 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 110 years or so. Where you see white, that simply indicates that the historical data records aren't good enough for us to talk about the trend, especially for the first half of that time period. There weren't really enough observations to speak of to calculate a trend. There's almost no places where, how's the volume, by the way? People hear me? Okay. There's a few small places where you see a slight light blue color. Over the North Atlantic and a little bit over the southeast U.S. Those are about the only places other than a few spots around Antarctica that have seen any cooling trend at all over the last 110 years. And those areas that I just pointed out have seen, the cooling trend they've seen is about an order of magnitude smaller than the warming trend that I just noted in the purple. So where you see a cooling trend, it's on the order of maybe like 0.5 degree Fahrenheit. And again, in the discussions, we can get into that a little bit. But again, it's basically the idea of shifting statistics. You can still get a 10, 20, maybe longer period in one spot where temperatures will be normal, a little below normal. But as you can see here, the statistics have already shifted. Why do we care? What do we care about 1 degree of global warming, which is basically what we've had since the Industrial Revolution? It sounds trivial, right? On a beautiful day like today, would we really care if the peak temperature hit 69 or hit 65? Can we really feel the difference? It doesn't seem intuitive that a degree of warming can matter really at all. But I want to take some time to show why it does matter so profoundly. So here's a schematic basically showing you a distribution of temperatures. Think of this as a year's worth of weather, 30 years worth of weather for New Canaan. So on the y-axis, you basically have frequency of occurrence, how often you have a day at a given temperature. And then the x-axis is essentially what the temperatures were. So over at this extreme, we can see it's very rare to get really cold days, days where maximum temperature maybe doesn't get above -10 Fahrenheit, let's say. Almost never happens. At the other end of the extreme in the red, you can see how rare it is to have a day where maximum temperature gets above 101, 102 degrees, something like that. By contrast, pretty common to get days like today, roughly 60 degrees. That would be sort of middle of the distribution. So the first point is that 1 degree of warming that we've experienced so far, that maybe 3 degrees of warming that we're going to get. We'll talk about that. Even if we don't change the distribution of this data set at all, if we assume that the variability remains just like it was in the past, just by virtue of shifting that mean by, let's say, the 3 degrees we expect in the future, doesn't have a big impact on the frequency with which you get days around 60 degrees. That percentage stays the same. But out at these tails, at the high end, the frequency of days over 100 degrees or so could triple with 3 degrees or so of warming. Those nights that historically have gotten maybe just cool enough to eliminate some of the most extreme health impacts, take a little strain off the air conditioning grid. You make all those nights 3 degrees warmer during a heat wave, it has a real big impact on us. At the cold end of the tail, a couple degrees of warming might be, the difference between, there are some benefits certainly, right? A little less for our heating bills, but what does it mean for some of our agricultural pests, for example, ecological pests, when they're not getting those extreme temperature thresholds that can kill them off as often? I'm highlighting the extremes here because that's what matters, right? That's primarily what we experience. We don't experience the average conditions. Now, the distribution might change as well. This is a really simple conservative case. But what if the statistics actually shift one way or the other? What if weather patterns change as we lose sea ice in the Arctic? What if as warmer temperatures dry out soil moistures, it creates a feedback whereby as the sun shines down, instead of a lot of that heat going towards evaporating moisture from the soil, as that soil dries out, it can warm the atmosphere more. That's the kind of thing that could stretch that tail out even further. Those are the kind of things that we need to think about. So this is just a schematic. What happens when we look at some actual data? Here you're looking at 1,800 different weather stations across the U.S., a very robust sample. And what I want to show is across all of these stations, how often by decade are we seeing record-breaking extremes of various types. A record-breaking high for the day depicted in red, a record-breaking low for the day depicted in blue. It's basically a ratio of how often you break a high record and a low record. High records could get broken in January, low records could get broken in July. It's just for all the days of the year, how often you experience a record-breaking extreme. For most of the past several decades, the ratio's been fairly near 1-to-1 as you'd expect with sort of an initial hypothesis. As we start to get out more recently into the last decade shown here, the 2000s, you can see that just with that 1 degree of warming that I mentioned, which sounds like nothing, we're now getting more than twice as many record-breaking high extremes as record-breaking cold. If we look at the last 7 years, you see the same pattern. It's even been a little bit stronger. I should note we can still find, and this is just for the US, but we see similar patterns in other places. If we look at an individual year, 2013 and 2014 for the US, we can still find occasional years where there's a more record-breaking cold than record-breaking hot by a bit. There's still some random variability, even for something as big as the United States. But as we average across more and more years, and of course when we're building our infrastructure, when we're planning for long-term changes, it's the long-term statistics that matter, and they've already shifted profoundly. I think in the interest of time, I won't say too much about this, but just to make a quick point here, a lot of the sort of central research that we're doing in my group now is trying to look not just at temperature, but combined impacts of temperature and humidity, right? That's what we really experience during these heat waves. That's a much better predictor of what the energy demand is going to be. So what we're showing here, just real quickly, on the left is essentially the day of the year, how bad this combination of temperature and humidity gets. The single day with the highest temperature and highest humidity. As you can see, a lot of parts of the tropics emerge, but a lot of the eastern US, you can see too, gets these wet bulb temperatures. This is this temperature humidity metric above 30 or so, which is a really high value. The key point, though, just to quickly make is what you can see on the right side of the figure, if people can make out the legend. What that's telling you is how often in the future, just 2 generations from now, a little less, how many days per year is that combination of temperature and humidity projected to exceed what we get once per year right now, right? So take sort of the worst heat humidity day that we experience right now, and for every spot on the globe, they each have their own sort of worst day per year, right? It's higher in a lot of parts of the tropics. As we go to the future, whatever that threshold temperature and humidity level is, how often per year is it going to get crossed in the future? What you can see is for large parts of the tropics, you're essentially approaching a situation where every day in the season is as bad as anything that used to be experienced once per year. Even over parts of the US, you're seeing on the order of 2 months per year getting spent at that threshold of temperature and humidity that we get once per year now. Small shifts in average conditions having a huge impact on the extremes that we experience. So now to sort of shift gears back and talk about sea level and coastal flooding a little bit more, to sort of dovetail with some of the points when we were talking about Sandy. This is nuisance flooding, right? So Sandy is those extreme 1 in 100 year high water level events that we know are so devastating. But in a lot of parts of the US and globally, they're contending much more frequently with what are called nuisance flooding events or king tide events. These are the types of things where you can't drive home maybe or drive to work, just little local flooding of your coastal road. Things you hear about in Miami more and more, where people are trying to open for business, there's 6 inches of water in their office. If this kind of thing is happening once, twice per year, maybe you can manage it. But what these plots are showing you is how with just a little bit of sea level rise to date, these events have already become much more common. 2 totally different regimes, one Charleston, South Carolina, one San Francisco. What you can see here, those yellow lines, we don't have a pointer, do we? It's not. Are showing you basically how many days per year you're experiencing that nuisance flooding. And already, just over the last 40 or 50 years, you can see that we're now getting those levels of flooding 50, 60 times per year in Charleston that used to happen just a few times per year, just by the virtue of that sea level rising 6 inches or so over that time. And as we get further out into the future, as sea levels rise more and more, for many different parts of the US and the globe, you start to see this nuisance flooding essentially happening close to all the time. So from an adaptation perspective, you may be able to deal with, the minor inconvenience, a few days per year of having to modify your travel, having to modify your business schedule. But at what point does it become sort of impossible to absorb, if you will, these kind of disruptions, nuisance flooding? But then, of course, also, as we heard in the clip, there's the more extreme kinds of flooding. So the figure on the right is showing you with 2 feet more of sea level rise, which is a very conservative projection of how much higher sea level could go. If we just get 2 feet more of sea level rise, and if storms don't change at all, so no stronger hurricanes or anything, just raising the floor another 2 feet will mean much more frequent extreme flooding for cities all across the US coast. So the colors here are showing you how many times per 100 years you'll experience the high water level that historically happened once every 100 years. And you can see for some of the major ports of Southern California, ports and big cities of the Southeast US, projections that every single year you're going to be experiencing a high water level of the type that only happened once every 100 years in the past, with 2 feet of sea level rise. This is not some 6-foot sea level rise scenario. This isn't much stronger hurricanes. This is just raising that floor another 2 feet. It's a transformative risk for our coastlines. Even in sort of the best case scenarios, some of the places are along the Gulf Coast, which ironically, because they get really big hurricanes, because there's this sort of sharp tail to the distribution before you get sea level rise, those places, it would seem, are maybe a little less affected by the 2 feet. But even there, things that used to happen once every 100 years to be expected within the lifetime of the typical mortgage, typical residential mortgage. At what point do property markets start to take up this risk? Is it really going to not happen until the water actually arrives? Or at some point are people going to realize if this perception shifts, if people start to understand this risk, that may be all it takes to have profound impacts on these markets. And we're seeing more and more some underwriters starting to say, you need to plan, you need to show you're thinking about this. Cities, for example, businesses, you better show that you're not just keeping track of your own emissions, but also thinking about how your operations and infrastructure are vulnerable to these sort of things, and if they are, how you're planning to prepare. Are you going to move further inland? Are you going to build seawalls? You got to have some kind of strategy. I think we're not quite there. I think there's still some companies that, especially in the US, maybe don't necessarily feel that they're going to have to take this language, but it's shifting and it's changing fast. Because this is essentially a given. We're locked into that 2 feet of sea level rise. This is not an extreme scenario. So the other way to think about it isn't just the change in the frequency of flooding. I think I'll go quickly here because we already saw this. Basically, for any given flood level, you can think that that sea level rise will mean, that same storm will mean more areas getting flooded. And you can see that for the New York region. The red and yellow are sort of additional areas that get flooded due to sea level rise, even with the same storm. And then a similar figure for New Orleans. Okay. So how do we link all this to our own experience, to emissions? This is sort of a complicated figure, but it's an important one. So we've said we've already had close to 1 degree Celsius of warming globally. So when we think about the global community, the UN's work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to get countries to come together to talk about their vulnerabilities, to advance the science, and to work together to make pledges through Paris, for example, to reduce emissions. One of the big things that emerged from Paris was discussion about just how far are we going to let this thing go? Just how much additional warming are we going to allow? If we don't reduce our emissions, most estimates suggest that by the end of the century, we could see at least 3 degrees Celsius of warming, maybe 4 degrees Celsius and more. The further we push that system, the more greenhouse gas we put into the atmosphere, the more the temperatures go up, the bigger the risk for surprises, some nonlinear feedbacks kicking in that make the situation much worse. To minimize that risk, we gotta dramatically reduce emissions. So if we go back to the sort of Paris conference, small island nations, a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa that are extremely vulnerable to higher temperatures and don't have a lot of strong adaptive capacity to begin with, those countries are advocating for us to limit warming to 2 degrees, even just 1.5 degrees Celsius. So I wanted to give a sense of just how challenging that is. I think we can do it, but it's a huge challenge and it's going to require some transformative steps. So basically what you're seeing here through that spiral is how many additional years we could continue globally to emit the same amount of greenhouse gases that we've been emitting for the last few years. So if we want to meet that 1.5 degrees Celsius target, which is again just another 0.5 degree Celsius or so of warming beyond what we've experienced today, we only have about 9 years. 9 there as the sort of most likely scenario. Not exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. You can keep emitting fossil fuels globally at the same level we have been for 9 years. Then you have to go to 0 the next year. You've used up the whole carbon budget. Straight to 0. It's not a gradual decrease after 9 years. It's going to 0. Maybe we say that's unrealistic. And a lot of people are saying that's unrealistic. It's also important to note, though, that that's an existential threat to a lot of small island nations if we go beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. But if we did want to try 2 degrees Celsius, hope for the best, looks a little better. Again, to have sort of a 50% chance of not blowing through that 2 Celsius target. Here's the 2 Celsius, here's the 50% chance. We get about 28 years, which, you know, to first order sounds better, right? Certainly there's be a lot of risks then. I mean, there's, if we want to have a 67% chance, we'd only have 20 years, right? So if we didn't get our estimate quite right, if the climate models weren't sensitive enough, it might turn out that we only had 20 years. Then again, immediately the next year we'd have to go to 0, right? Keeping in mind that we don't have any substitutes right now for aviation-related emissions, for example. There aren't any substitutes in the pipeline. That's responsible right now for about 3% of global emissions. Shipping responsible for another 3% or so. So this is an extreme challenge, but I think we can do it. So let's now talk a little bit about some of these impacts. What does a world look like where we don't stop emissions and where we don't limit them to these levels? So starting with some of the more kind of trivial ones, not trivial but less dire ones, we've already observed a big increase in the growing season length. Maybe we'll be surprised to hear that after this April in the Northeast, but you can see that this has been expanding. I'll mention quickly also one thing we've observed close to home in the Northeast is that heavy rain events now about 70% more common than they were 2 generations ago. We don't know if all of that is due to climate change. There's a lot of year-to-year variability in extreme precipitation. But if we look across the whole eastern U.S. and a lot of the globe, we find similar patterns. Heavy rain events sort of match our intuition. They are happening more often than they used to in the past. So what are some of the impacts on ecosystems of these rising temperatures? I mentioned earlier that pests are affected. We had a paper last year on the southern pine beetle showing that it's been moving north really quickly in the northeast, as we're not getting those extreme killing cold temperatures as often in the past. Within the oceans, we're seeing extreme sensitivity, not just to the warming that's been experienced, but additional carbon in the oceans is causing acidification. Things that need to make shells are finding it more difficult to do so than they did in the past. Put those higher temperatures and that higher amount of carbon in the ocean together, we don't know what all the impacts are going to be and how it's going to make its way up the food chain. Water systems, very sensitive. A lot of parts of the world, such as California, to be honest, we still don't totally know if rainfall is going to go down in California. Some models suggest it will. Some models suggest it'll stay about the same or maybe even go up. But what we've realized in the last 5 or 10 years is that California would need way more rainfall in the future just to maintain the soil moisture balance and the water availability that they had in the past. And the reason is because of the impact of temperature, which is subtle. We think of a drought as only being driven by rainfall, but that's wrong. As temperatures go up, 2 really important things happen. The first is that snow reservoir becomes less effective. Basically, most of California gets the majority of its precipitation during their cold season. A lot of it gets stored up in the mountains and then gradually releases as temperatures go up in June, July, and August when it's not raining at all. With those higher temperatures, some of those snow events become rain events that wash that snow away. And more generally, it's just a shorter period of the year when that snow can fall. It starts to melt earlier in the year. And by the time you get to August or September, still key agricultural months in some of those valleys, you may not have that water supply anymore just because of the temperature going up. Furthermore, with higher temperatures during summer, for example, in those agricultural regions, there's going to be a lot more evaporation than there was in the past. That soil moisture is going to get sucked up a lot faster just due to those hotter temperatures. So all we're shifting is temperature, and it's having a profound impact on the risk of serious droughts in a lot of parts of the world. Sea level rise impacts, we saw the video. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but I want to, point out quickly, how subtle some of these things are. You can't just look, right in your backyard and say, what's climate change right here going to mean for me? We're learning more and more about how all this is interconnected. I mean, one of the examples, some people may recognize this, Space Coast. This is essentially our only launch capacity within the U.S. NASA's not launching that much anymore, but a lot of our most sensitive satellites, communication systems, commercial, but also top secret stuff gets launched from those launch pads or one just like them a little ways up the coast. They're right there, right along the coast, vulnerable to nor'easters today. That's the NASA Kennedy Space Center, a part of it depicted right there. If we lose that launch capacity, which becomes more likely as the seas rise, it's easier for storms to penetrate those launch pads. There's no plan B. There certainly isn't a plan B launch capacity within the U.S. At least. So that's one example of the kind of maybe non-intuitive ways. Then there are the much more direct ways I mentioned earlier. Small island nations like Tuvalu. I mean, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees Celsius, that additional warming, that island goes away. Existential threat to that culture, the tradition of burying their ancestors on the land there as well. Regions with huge populations, if we think of some of these delta regions here, Bangladesh coastline, could tell the same story for neighboring Myanmar, a lot of China and the Southeast Asian coast, but also a lot of other places too. As they get just a little bit of sea level rise, these areas become inundated, more frequent storm surges, salt getting into these agricultural regions. If we don't dramatically reduce emissions, there's going to be a huge story of human suffering, people trying to move to other regions. The geopolitical consequences of this are enormous. And some of these vulnerabilities you can just sort of see quickly by looking at how folks are living. Do I have 10 more minutes, or what do you think? Okay.
All right. I want to show some slides I haven't shown before, which is always a little risky, but I think, I think this audience is going to be interested to hear about some work coming out of Lamont Dougherty Earth Observatory, where I work. Was it full screen mode that we go to here? Okay. Work on sort of links historically between climate, social instability, and conflict. I don't have time to take you through this whole story, which goes back to examples from several thousand years ago. Heidi Cullen, actually, the person who was in the video with me, was a key author about 20 years ago in some of this work. But basically linking various droughts to collapses of civilizations. I just want to quickly show you a couple of things. The first is some literature that's just come out in the last 5-10 years or so, separate from climate change, just looking at the impact of El Nino, a natural oscillation of ocean temperatures across the tropical Pacific, 2 to 7 years variability. Sometimes you're in an El Nino state where the eastern Pacific is very warm. Sometimes you're in a La Nina state, which is essentially the reverse of that. And depending on which state you're in, you have these global, what are called teleconnections. The tropical oceans are a driver of the whole atmospheric circulation. And when you're in that extreme El Nino state, some areas tend to be warmer than normal, drier than normal across the whole globe. You can see there some of the impacts of El Nino. So I don't have time to go into the details, but what I want to show you is a study that looked at what are called teleconnected regions, shown in the tan and red color there. Those are the areas that do have El Nino impacts, some of them far away from the tropical Pacific. And then the blue band is areas where you don't see El Nino impacts. You don't expect the climate to change there, whether it's an El Nino event or not. And when you're more towards the El Nino state on the right, the teleconnected regions were found to have a higher risk of conflict. And they looked at conflict at various scales, everything from sort of building level, more arguments to like even, national scale conflicts. El Nino years are a little bit warmer than La Nina years. And just to sort of give a little bit of a sense of how big the magnitude is, they estimated that in those countries where there's a strong El Nino impact on, say, temperature or rainfall, that change in risk of conflict was comparable to the change in risk that you see when per capita income, when you compare countries with a per capita income of $1,000 versus $10,000. This is still pretty speculative research in a lot of ways. These are early days. I mentioned earlier the dangers of sort of trying to put two graphs together. But I think there's a lot of research sort of moving more and more into this direction. It's been a very sort of taboo topic for a variety of reasons, some of them very legitimate. But this is something that's on a lot of people's minds right now. And I got to quickly talk about another, I think, speculative example. But again, as we're thinking about migration, as we're thinking about unpredictable geopolitical risk, I think we have a responsibility from a risk management perspective to think about some of these things, just in case they're true. If there's only a 15-20% chance they're true, because some of the impacts are catastrophic. So I mentioned earlier, higher temperatures dry out soils. Anywhere you see the brown here, projections for a lot drier conditions in the future, more drought risk. Can we look at some of the things that have been happening in the Eastern Mediterranean, for example, in recent years? Not say that they're entirely caused by climate, but say that in a complex environment with complex social geopolitical systems, could climate potentially explain some portion of what's being experienced? Can it tip the scales? Can it increase the risk of things heading in a more severe direction? So when we run climate models over a historic period over the last 50 years, like I showed earlier, increasing the greenhouse gases as we go in a historical run, the models suggest that most of the Mediterranean should dry out a little bit. 10 or 15% less precipitation per year on average in Syria, for example, Eastern Mediterranean there. If we look at the actual historical trend, so that was what a model tells you should happen due to greenhouse gases. Here's what we've actually observed. Syria as a whole in winter, and then in these two locations. Rainfall on the y-axis, average rainfall here. Anywhere you see a red dot, that's a year where temperatures were below normal. You get years that are wet, but more and more of these dry years. Now, it's important that I showed you what the models give as well, because I'm making the case that this is partly due to human activities. If we just look at this, How do we know it's the human activities? A lot of it might just be, random decades of weather or something. But the climate models support the idea if you increase greenhouse gases, you should see less rainfall. Balance of evidence suggests. So we start to unpack some of these stories of what's been observed. More and more refugees, more and more people moving to cities. Destabilization of the regime is basically agriculture is failing in a lot of these areas, partly with a climate component, we're arguing, not entirely due to climate. Another component was looking at longer historical records, right? We only have weather stations for the last 100 years or so. But if we go back and look at tree ring records that can take us back 1,000 years or so, for the Western Mediterranean, for Greece, and for the Levant, for this eastern portion we're talking about, you can see just how extreme we think some of these recent droughts have been. That's the year 1100. This is the period of the last 100 years or so. And it looks like the worst droughts of record over that 1,000-year period have fallen during this recent period. So the argument seems to suggest that climate change is increasing the risk of these droughts. Certainly as we go further into the future with higher temperatures, we expect that. But as importantly, there's extreme societal sensitivity to climate. 1 degree matters, much more than might seem intuitive. Okay, so now I'm about ready to wrap. If I can quickly get back to this. And let's just quickly, sort of transition to a little bit to this discussion that I think going to be looking forward to having about what we can do about all this. I've painted a pretty pessimistic portrait in a lot of ways. Climate change seems to be happening faster than climate models thought it would, and we seem to be more societally vulnerable than we thought with some of our linear agricultural models, for example. Key points, we've learned basically that small changes in average conditions can be associated with large changes in the frequency, intensity, and duration of climate extremes. We're very worried about tipping points as well, which I haven't even really gotten into that much. If Arctic sea ice disappears, something that climate models didn't think would happen this soon, what might happen next? Is it going to change our weather patterns? Is it going to change the carbon cycle? If it does, climate models aren't going to be in a good position to tell us about it because they didn't predict that it would happen that fast. So from a risk management perspective, this is the fear of sort of tail risk. Fortunately, I think there are some reasons for optimism as well. Societal tipping points can turn both ways. I showed a sort of scary version of how you can get into a regime of conflict where it's hard to work towards the future, work collaboratively. But we can also imagine some ways that as we see more businesses, for example, being forced to disclose their climate risk, to maybe put a price on carbon or have to acknowledge their emissions, I do think there's reputational risk there. There's potential liability. That's a longer reach. But just the fact that people are seriously starting to talk about liability may itself sort of confer enough risks to get businesses to sort of all come to the plate on this. Paris showed that non-state actors, NGOs, cities are starting to really shape the debate. When a state as big as California has their own standards for car emissions, industries can't afford to ignore that no matter what the federal government is doing. There's optimism on the greenhouse gas mitigation side. We've seen the price of a lot of these renewables reach parity with traditional fossil fuels. And we're seeing a lot happen in the adaptation spaces too. I do a lot of work with New York City that maybe we can talk about later. New York City for a decade now has been really embracing and thinking about their vulnerabilities. So as I said, renewables are becoming competitive with fossil fuels in many parts of the world. It's also become clear that energy usage can drop even as economic productivity goes up. That was an old chestnut for a long time that you'd hear that, well, we can't ever reduce our energy without losing economic growth. Turns out that's not the case. Land use changes can support mitigation as well. And as I said, these new and powerful actors and levers are emerging. Cities, investor groups, bond raters who are insisting that people talk about these climate risks. But there are still challenges, right? The fossil fuel subsidies, challenges of energy storage and electricity transmission. We don't always see the renewables exactly at the times and places where we need them. And as I said earlier, we don't have solutions yet for airplane fuel, for example, and some other things that we rely heavily on. But that's where we need to see the younger generation helping to make that happen. I think what we need to do is basically move quickly to reduce our emissions and adapt so we buy ourselves the time so we don't get surprised, so that these new technologies can come along to ultimately extract carbon from the atmosphere. We're not there now, but if we move aggressively enough, we give ourselves a chance for this positive narrative to continue to play out in the future. So I do feel optimistic in many regards in that way. So thank you. Unplug it. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Bradley. Bradley took care of the science and some of the solutions for me. I'm going to shift to the public perception of what's going on. So by a show of hands, how many of you heard this sort of information before? Okay, a lot of you. Did some of you hear some new things, I take it? Yeah? All right, but still pretty extraordinary that I don't think, we encounter this kind of material every day. And it begs the question, why is that? Why isn't everyone talking about it all the time? It's probably the most serious crisis we face today. So I wanted to talk about my industry, the media. The media doesn't cover this at all for a variety of reasons. 2017 was a record year for weather and climate disasters, but the broadcast news networks of CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, and even PBS had only a total of 4 segments contextualizing Hurricane Harvey, Maria, Irma, and the disastrous wildfires out in California to climate. Totally avoiding any mention that there is a relationship, which has been, attributed by scientists. So let's talk about politicians. Well, maybe not, but we have to, unfortunately. They should obviously be talking about it, something as serious as this, to this and future generations. But with few exceptions, they don't. I have to mention that those few exceptions happen to be on the Democratic side of the aisle. If you are a member of the Republican Party, either in Congress or running for Congress, mentioning the words climate and change is a career risk. And that always wasn't the case. I just want to show you another clip that helps to explain why. I can just, 1 second here. Sorry, 1 second.
We all know that human activities are changing the atmosphere in unexpected and in unprecedented ways.
This is George H.W. Bush speaking to a global gathering of climate scientists in 1990. Today, it seems unimaginable that a Republican president would sound the alarm on global warming.
The stakes here are very high.
But he was just continuing a long tradition of Republican environmentalism. It was Richard Nixon who created the EPA and signed the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts.
Preservation of our environment is not a liberal or conservative challenge. It's common sense.
Even Ronald Reagan took action to protect the ozone layer. In the early 2000s, John McCain fought for a cap-and-trade bill designed to curb CO2 emissions, the first national legislation of its kind.
Mr. President, that's the Arctic Sea. That's the Arctic Sea. And you look at the red line, the boundary of it in 1979. Look at it now. You can believe me or your lying eyes.
And in 2008, when McCain was the party's nominee for president, addressing climate change was part of the official Republican platform. There seemed to be a growing consensus between Democrats and Republicans on the issue.
We don't always see eye to eye, do we, Newt?
No, but we do agree our country must take action to address climate change.
And it seemed like Washington was taking action. A climate change bill actually passed the House in 2009. But the energy sector, led by fossil fuel companies, spent $500 million in lobbying and campaign contributions to fight it.
Drill over
America's oil! Mine all America's coal!
By the time it reached the Senate, not even John McCain would support it. Soon, Gingrich flip-flopped.
That's probably the dumbest single thing I've done in recent years.
And the Tea Party, with lots of oil and gas money behind it, helped elect people like Michael Grimm.
I personally am one of the guys that has been skeptical of global warming from the beginning. The jury is obviously still out on it.
Suddenly, saying you accepted the science on climate change could cost you your seat. Just ask Bob Inglis.
A conservative who says that climate change is real? Now that is an unusual zoo animal, right?
A six-term congressman from South Carolina, Inglis was the most vocal Republican member of Congress calling for action on climate change.
A lot of people are elected based on coal money, on oil money.
I mean, how do you break through that if...
Well, it's tough. It's real tough. But, I mean, we just can't keep this up.
In 2010, he lost his seat to a Tea Party candidate in the Republican primary.
I had done some things that were clearly problems politically. But the most enduring heresy was just saying that climate change is real. And let's do something about it.
Since leaving Congress, Inglis is traveling the country, pitching a conservative solution to climate change. It would tax companies that emit CO2, but give a matching tax cut to other companies and American households. And he's trying to convince Republicans that despite what happened to him, they can't keep denying reality forever.
The worst thing in the world is not losing an election. The worst thing in the world is losing your soul. When you know the things you believe in and you're not willing to stand for them.
Well, that takes on a different veneer in 2017 or 2018, I should say. So just back, I should mention, by the way, the Republican Party is the only major political party in the world that has climate denial as part of its party platform. So back to why we're not talking about this. The media is not talking about it. Politicians, for various reasons, aren't talking about it. And therefore, you're not talking about it. And therefore, neither of the other two are going to talk about it anytime soon. So we're in this sort of spiral where culture of silence, where nobody is addressing the issue of our time. And we have a tree, essentially, climate change falling in the woods, and no one's heard it. This is not by accident. For decades, as the clip alluded to, this one example, hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent to sow doubt about the science in the public's mind and prevent governments from acting in any meaningful way. And I'm not going to belabor you with clips, but I do have one that is rather illustrative. This is Joe Bast. He's the CEO of the Heartland Institute, one of the leading groups that is sowing doubt about the science. Late last year, he was caught on tape at their annual conference addressing donors, and he said this.
I think we achieved what we hoped to achieve. The president has done a great job by not talking about global warming. The less the president talks about it, the less often it appears in news stories and on TV, the less often it's going to be an issue. So this is how big issues disappear. They start taking grants away from the academics, when environmental groups have to look for some other issue to get traction on.
So you see, it's not that crazy what I'm revealing here. And the strategy is working. The less you talk about it, the less people are able to do something about it. So according to a recent Gallup poll, fewer Republicans say they believe that there is a scientific consensus on climate change or that the effects of global warming have already begun. 9 out of 10 Democrats worry about global warming. Only a third of Republicans do. 7 in 10 Republicans think the seriousness of global warming is generally exaggerated, while 1 in 25 Democrats do. And this gap has widened just in this past year. So in the midst of this sort of polarization under the current administration, science is under attack. You know, you have climate not being in the headlines, not on the legislative agenda. And there's various efforts to dismiss scientists from advisory boards. The word climate change has been removed from government websites and even from grant proposals. If your work in any way touches on the reality of climate science, it therefore threatens fossil fuels, and that becomes a risk as a scientist. But from the perspective of the people in the current administration, that's the point. If you don't have any science, you don't have a problem. So think about that in light of what you just heard from Radley. I won't go into all the details, but if you read, mainstream news, many of them are talking about, some of them, all the various environmental regulations, protections under assault. But we have to ask who's ultimately responsible. These are some of the same people who gave money to groups like Heartland, who you just played the clip from. And they give money to every level of government, from states to Congress and to presidents. So I'll just go through a few of them here. Pardon some of the layout of these slides, but I'll go through them quickly. So the Koch brothers. This is Charles. Sorry, this is David. That's Charles. They are the country's 6 richest people tied together. They run the largest privately owned energy company in America. For over 40 years, they've built a political network that this year pledges to spend $400 million on midterms. The Koch network is responsible in large part for the Tea Party, which you heard about earlier. And there are about 44 Koch operatives now working in Washington, the highest levels of the Trump administration, including Vice President Pence, who's a longtime Koch network protege. So they've even taken credit for some of the policies that have been enacted in the last year, including rolling back the Clean Power Plan, which was Obama's signature initiative to curtail power plant pollution. They've taken credit for convincing Trump to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, and they've also were able to give a big break in the tax bill passed late last year for the fossil fuel industry. Real quickly, these are the Mercers, who you may have seen in coverage as of late. They're big Trump donors, supporters of Steve Bannon, Breitbart News, and Cambridge Analytica. But they also, in their spare time, support groups like the Heartland Institute and other groups that promote climate denial. This is Bob Murray. He's runs one of the largest coal companies in America, and was probably single-handedly responsible for getting the coal miners and the coal industry to turn out in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia in the 2016 election for Trump. Late last year, he presented a list of 16 policy demands to Trump administration officials and is now on track to get every single one of them fulfilled. The oil industry, or the rest of the oil industry beyond the Koch brothers. Here's something you guys may not know, but we at the Years Project are working on. The oil industry, the big ones, have known about the potential risks of climate change since at least 1959. So 60 years. So when Radley says shows the circular graph saying we only have about 10 years to meet 1.5, think about how long we've been sitting on our haunches, not investing in the things that we needed to invest in. So you would think with that knowledge, these oil companies would do something to invest in next generation technology, less emitting technology. And in fact, Exxon at least, had a whole research department full of climate scientists who were studying this problem, and they were modeling it. And remarkably, this was back in the late 70s, their models were very accurate. And they, even were looking into producing an electric car, if you can believe it. We don't know about this. They don't necessarily want us to know about it, because in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, after they came to the conclusion that, climate was a very big threat to all of us and to their industries, they decided to double down on oil production and spend hundreds of millions of dollars sowing doubt we're not really sure, you know, where things are going to land, and basically undercutting what scientists knew very well back then, including their own. So Exxon wasn't the only one. Shell, Chevron, they all have similar histories. And that's why several cities and states around the country are now suing them for product liability. Real quickly, the auto industry, they too have, it's been a struggle to get them on board with pollution devices and certainly in climate. So, you know, recently, in the wake of the auto bailout, they agreed to increase the efficiency of their vehicle fleet. All cars and trucks together would have had to have averaged out to 54 miles a gallon by 2025. And, you know, they were largely on track. But then gas got a little cheaper and SUVs started to come back. And they've actually made 50% more SUVs in the last 5 years, and nearly 2/3 of all new vehicles sold are trucks and SUVs. So, long story short, they're trying to get out of the deal currently, and the transition to electric vehicles is going to happen probably a lot more slowly with that. Aside from GM, Chevy Bolt, which you may have seen or heard about, none of the other American car companies have an all-electric model introduced. Finally, the utility industry, they've also known since 1968 that climate was an existential threat, or was that their emissions from power plants, mostly coal plants, were altering the climate irreversibly. But again, in the intervening years, they too helped finance a campaign of climate denial. So nowadays, they're taking on renewables, which in many parts of the country are competitive with or even cheaper than power derived from fossil fuels, as Radley mentioned. So I just wanted to show you a quick clip of what the lengths that they will go to make sure that rooftop solar doesn't happen within the states that they operate.
It's shocking to learn that rooftop solar has so many enemies here in Nevada. But Brian Miller says there are even bigger forces at play.
Let me just tell you what this fight's about. In one word, this fight is about competition. Rooftop solar is the first form of competition that utilities have ever faced. And so the utility strategy is to quietly go to the legislators and get them to kill solar under the cover of darkness.
Well, how do you know all of that?
I actually used to work at the largest utility in the country when these modern rooftop solar wars started. And it was
Really?
Yeah, I did. I was at the time in a progressive, forward-thinking utility that was actually trying to develop solar. And then they got bought by an even bigger utility. It became the largest utility in the country. And my new bosses came to me one day and said, listen, I know you think your job was to promote renewables. Your new job in this newly formed company is to eliminate all renewables at all costs, and specifically rooftop solar.
That's crazy.
It was pretty crazy. It was a pretty surreal experience. And I said, well, I'm sort of accidentally in the middle of the Death Star here. I should probably figure out how the thing works before I leave. And I was in internal discussions where they plotted the campaigns on these issues.
And what were some of the tactics discussed?
Yeah. Well, specifically, the idea was that all of our team of lobbyists would go and fan across the country and lobby against renewable energy policies, specifically rooftop solar policies. So
and you were asked?
I was asked to do that too.
Wow.
I think what surprised me the most is being in a fossil fuel company that was that big. I was like awed at their extent of political influence. I mean, it was just stunning. I remember at one point in a state capitol that the utility had dozens of paid lobbyists on retainer in this little capital. What they would actually do, and utilities across the country do this, we run into it all the time, is they will go to lobbyists in town and give them a retainer of $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 and say, we are paying you not to work. We are just going to give you this money. As long as you agree not to work for renewable interests against us, we will just give you the money to do nothing and be conflicted out from representing clean energy. You know, if you've got unlimited resources, those are the kind of tactics you deploy.
So, I'm going to wrap it up here. I just want to make it clear that for these industries, that emit carbon, doing something about climate change is a real problem, and that makes it a real problem for us. And just to sort of piggyback on something Radley said, we have very little time, thanks to these guys, but there are technologies out there already ready to go, and we just need to implement them. And it's not like this hasn't happened before. So remember the landline? I mean, I guess we still have them, but they're starting to fade out. The world didn't end. Typewriters? When's the last time you typed something on a typewriter? Color TV? We miss black and white, anyone? Whale oil? I think we moved on. So again, the utility or the fossil fuel argument is that in an age of Netflix, we need to double down on videotapes and Blockbuster. So anyway, there's a lot more to discuss, but I'll leave it for questions. The point is that we all need to get on board with the science and have a consensus and a political discussion if we're to get out of this jam. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're going to open up to Q&A now.
Thank you. It's been a most interesting discussion. I will give you two examples of what is happening right now. One we're all aware of, that Puerto Rico lost its energy, and Elon Musk said we should do solar. And what are we doing? We're putting up those same wires that are going to come down immediately. It's costing millions of dollars of American taxpayer money to do the same thing that we've done and expect a different result. Okay, I'll give you another example. Right now here, last week in the Connecticut legislature, they were discussing whether they should pass a bill for they call it shared solar in Connecticut rather than community solar. As we know, many houses are not adaptable for solar because they have a lot of trees, etc. So the best solution is to have community solar. And you can go on and explain what this is if you want to. And we're so behind in the state of Connecticut because Massachusetts, New York, all has legislation allowing this. I don't know how many states have it. I don't have the statistics, but we're so behind, right, sitting here now. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Something that neither of you mentioned was about the meat industry, which I'm aware on a very individual level that we can actually impact our own climate footprint by reducing the amount of meat that we eat. Can you touch on how much of a percentage that contributes to carbon dioxide emissions?
Yeah, I mean, sort of at the broadest scale, our decisions about land use, you know, a big part of which is eating high on the food chain, eating meat, is estimated to be somewhere between 20, by some estimates, as much as sort of 33% maybe of emissions, probably something more like 20. There's a lot of things at play there, but a big part of it is meat. I don't remember the exact numbers, but if people even reduce their meat consumption, especially red meat consumption is sort of the biggest offender by 20%, 50%, it would be the equivalent of I don't have the exact numbers, but it's very significant. It's one of the big drivers for a typical person. It could even be comparable, you know, if you went all the way off of meat to you know, the amount that some people fly per year, for example. People at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of, you know, how many miles they fly. If you fly a lot, that completely dominates everything else. Because a mile spent in a plane is almost as bad as a mile driving. Yeah.
I noticed when we were looking at the outputs of the various models that a lot of them sort of blow up as you go further off into time. I'm wondering what happens on the right-hand side of those graphs is there a steady state that is eventually reached, or is there just sort of increasing volatility as you go into time? Or, yeah, actually, what happens as time goes on? What's the bigger picture even?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, because it depends on what graph we're looking at. But for all intents, so in the broadest sense, there is and positive feedback is something we don't want. That's something where an initial change due to greenhouse gases modifies the planet in a way that leads to even more warming. That's what we call positive feedback. Balance of evidence suggests that in the timescales we care about, there's more positive feedbacks than negative feedbacks. Just to give a few quick examples, I mentioned how we're losing Arctic sea ice as the planet warms. We lose a white surface that was really effective at sending sunlight back to space. As it goes away, we have one of the darkest surfaces imaginable, the ocean, that takes up that heat. Those kind of positive feedbacks, which make an initial problem worse, appear to dominate in the near term. But there are a couple quick points. One, if we go to like the time scale of the planetary history, clearly there are negative feedbacks out there. The planet's probably not going to ever turn into Venus, certainly not in the time scales that we care about. There are negative feedbacks that kick in, but the real question is, how relevant is that to us today with the challenges that we face to humanity? More people, we know we can't take any more warming, any more sea level. Somewhere out there are negative feedbacks in the distant long term, but I think they're not relevant for humanity. But just to say, a little about what they are. Eventually, when carbon dioxide concentrations become far, far higher, you can reach sort of a saturation point where additional carbon doesn't actually have that much impact because you essentially have so much that it's saturated. But we're nowhere near that. That's sort of like order of magnitude more carbon. But that would be one example of a negative feedback.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I have two questions. One is, can you comment on the cap and trade? How is this being adopted? How is it growing? The other is about carbon capture. Can you comment on that too?
Sorry, I was trying to find out. Speaking. What was the last question? Sorry.
Carbon capture.
Oh, carbon capture. My understanding, first of all, there's some tax incentives that have been passed recently that might get the research going. But to date, there are just a handful of test sites around the world. The market doesn't exist for it. So unless, and I was going to get to this in my presentation, unless there is a price on carbon, carbon capture is just kind of a waste of time, because why would you pay extra to store carbon? You need to get paid for that, in other words. So the market has to work in a way that it acknowledges that carbon is a pollutant that we need to get rid of. I don't know, technically.
I think, yeah, so cap and trade, yeah, I think, clearly their price of carbon, can have a clear impact. Cap and trade, we're seeing sort of halting steps. We're seeing regional markets coming online. There are some cap and trade markets. They're still not, at dominant scales, but we are seeing some of those partnerships. The problem is they tend to set the caps so low that it effectively doesn't impact the price very much. That's what we've seen. That's one of the problems. In terms of carbon capture, we're starting to see some technologies that sort of in theory can take a little bit of carbon out of the atmosphere, but they're so expensive right now, we have no ability to do them anywhere close to its scale. It's good to see. We've had a few pleasant surprises. They've seen, for example, that if you happen to be right next to a big fossil fuel plant where you have a concentrated source of carbon, flue, in a few instances like that, if you have just the right formation, if you have a kind of basalt, it actually is very effective, more effective even than they thought, at relatively quickly locking that carbon up. But these are just like cherry-picked examples. We're nowhere near being able to do that at scale right now. But who can say a couple generations from now what might become, if we give ourselves a chance to get there.
What's your estimate? What's your estimate of the percentage of emissions from the United States compared to the total world?
So yeah, there's a few ways to take this one. In a given day today or a given year today, we're now down to 20%, even a little bit less. than what it used to be. China's ahead of us. The EU is sort of comparable to us. But an important thing to keep in mind is that a lot of that carbon, it lasts for over 100 years or so. So if we go back and integrate through time, the warming, the sea level rise that we had, we're still the dominant contributor, even though China, for example, has passed us. And per capita, we're still one of the leading contributors. Australia, a few other countries are ahead of us, but per capita, we're still, leading the way on fossil fuel emissions.
Wringing our hands in despair, which basically is what you said, doesn't seem to me a very good action plan. It's pretty clear that over the next decade, there's not going to be the political will in this country, I don't know about the rest of the world, probably not in Europe either, to do what is needed to keep the climate, the temperature rise from going up. It sounds like the only thing that is happening positively is hopefully competitive forces will make renewables better than fossil fuel. Is that a realistic possibility that in a reasonable period of time we can come to the point without the benefit of political force to make the changes needed?
Well, I would say it is happening right now around the world. Solar and wind are breaking records. I think, very soon, in some parts of the world it already is, but very soon, sort of globally, solar and wind will be some of the cheapest power within a few years available. So that's all happening, and I would beg to differ with you. I think, in many ways, Europe and China and other places, they do have the will. We're the ones who don't, and just given our position as the world's, leading emitter and historically and per capita and so forth, the world's not going to get there without us. And so I do think you got to have the political will. That's just, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it.
I have a question, both scientific and media related. We talked about carbon capture really briefly. What about planting trees? Friday is Arbor Day, and I, for one, want to plant a new tree in my backyard. We lost a lot of trees in the nor'easters over the winter. But what if we, put out on social media and we got 1 billion trees planted? Would that have any impact on the climate change? I know you've talked about land use. And how could we do that via the media or via social media?
So, it all helps. It would help, but it wouldn't do enough. I think a lot of the biggest benefits from planting trees are sort of locally what they do in terms of shade, reducing urban heat island. But don't get me wrong, it helps. If we could have more tree planting. Another thing people are talking about now, there's a Times article on this in the magazine today, soil practices, have potential to help a lot. There's few people out there who suggest that, that in itself would solve the whole problem. But maybe it helps. Maybe it buys us a little more time. Decreases the odds that we get a sort of surprise on the negative side that takes this all out of our hands. So it's sort of all hands on deck. I think maybe the most another compelling aspect to what you said was sort of mentioning the social movement. I think that's really the key. We need to think about tipping points not just in the climate system but more in the societal response side. Are we really that far necessarily from a point where basically virtually every economic decision that's made is sort of forced to consider climate vulnerability and exposure? If we reach that point, things become possible immediately that aren't really imaginable today, I think. I'm not sure they happen fast enough to avoid the situations you're talking about. Renewables are coming on so fast. They are reaching parity unless you've already built a coal plant. The problem is we've built these plants that are going to continue to be cheap. So we need that price on carbon, and we are going to need a kind of social movement, and we're going to need adaptation. That's the other part of the discussion we didn't have a chance to talk to about. Locally, adaptation can help reduce some of these vulnerabilities. Even before climate change, we have so many vulnerable people. It's not going to get us all the way there, but in some instances, it can help sort of buy us more time. But that's just going to be a part of the story to reduce risk and buy us time.
I just want to add one thing. The other way to look at it is as your doom and gloom kind of question is, the other way to look at it is that this is the biggest opportunity since, I don't know, somebody invented rolled steel or something bigger than that. I leave it to the scientists, to historians to tell me. But to your point on cap and trade, Reggie, the regional Northeast Gas Initiative, which is a limited cap and trade plan, just came out with a report after 9 years. It's reduced carbon by 50%, created something like 400,000 jobs. I may have that, I think I got that right, and $1.5 billion worth of value. So that's just a limited thing. Imagine the opportunities when we put our minds together. Every industry, insurance is pricing the risk. Wall Street is seeing what needs to happen. It could be very exciting. It doesn't have to be depressing.
Job opportunities. Yeah.
For those of us who've been environmental activists for longer than I can even think, and I'm sure there are a lot of them in this room, it's hard to find a way to do anything positive today that has an effect. I live in Norwalk, and we have decided to push on educating people about the issue of fracking waste, because there's a whole ripple effect of bans by local towns. There are 42 towns in the state that have already banned having fracking waste brought into their town for any reason. And implementation of the ban is always the hardest thing to figure out. We've got a meeting coming up that we've scheduled on May 2nd with people who have lived firsthand with fracking and the effects. She was somebody who grew up in Pennsylvania. And in fact, I think she may have been here before at one of these other lectures. She worked for Food and Water Watch. Anyway, we feel that most people just aren't interested. You know, we're lazy. We live in a democracy, and we don't understand that democracy requires action. So anybody who's here who wants to learn about fracking waste, May 2nd in Rowayton, the cafeteria of the Rowayton Elementary School, you're more than welcome to come. It's just a small thing, but there are a lot of people who don't understand what fracking is, and they don't understand about what it can do if it comes in and be put on the roads as a de-icer or mixed with concrete in some of the buildings that are going up. So it's a beginning, but I think we just have to start with small things to get people interested again.
Thank you.
I totally agree. Meet people where their interests are. Climate, for example, is going to touch everybody. You know, whether do they care about their children's health, their grandchildren's health? Do they care about security? There's going to be some issue. You mentioned these opportunities, the jobs of the future. There's going to be a way to engage and excite people. And never underestimate the value of a single conversation. Never be afraid to speak your mind. It's that sort of tipping point behavior. Things actually, I think, could flip fairly fast. I think they will. The question is it going to be fast enough?
Thank you so much for this incredible talk. Thank you to Shakeba Bennett, Christina, the others from the UN Club who brought our wonderful speakers this afternoon.